I'm Ashley Harwood, 31, and I'm standing in a glass-walled conference room watching my reflection steady behind a stack of contracts. Dad stares at the name placard at the head of the table, mine, and swallows like he's just tasted something bitter. Todd, my brother, fidgets in his chair and taps a pen against the wood while the union rep sits opposite him, arms folded. Nora, my partner at Harborline Capital, arranges the signature pages with a calm I taught her to keep. Grace, the lead bank representative, flips to the default clause and does not blink. "Do you work here?" Dad asks, like finding a familiar face could erase the numbers on a page. "No," I tell him, voice even for the room and the cameras. "I'm the owner." Sandra, the Business Journal reporter, lifts her phone. Ellen, the board chair, quietly closes her notebook. Pete, the floor supervisor, looks between Dad and me like gravity just changed. Before I tell you how I orchestrated this and why Dad and Todd left this room without titles or parachutes, tell me where you're listening from in the comments. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more family revenge stories. I read every single one. The Harwood hierarchy was set before I was born. Our last name arrived with expectations and an invisible job description. Keep the legacy tidy, keep the men in front, keep the women liminal. Dad loved Order the way other people loved music. He arranged people into roles and smiled when they stayed put. Todd would inherit, Mom would host, and I would support. At family dinners, Todd's ideas were bold and required celebration. Mine were helpful and came with a side of cutlery duty. When I brought home straight A's in math and physics, Dad said they were nice to have. When Todd scored on the high school field, there was a framed photo and a steak dinner. I learned very young that my value in that house was measured by how invisible I made my labor. Praise for me always came with a task attached. "Good job, now fix the supply list." No tantrums, no visible mess. No requests that might interrupt the smooth flow of someone else's plan. Be the solution nobody had to thank. I spent weekends on the plant floor because I wanted to understand the work, not because Dad asked me to. The shop smelled like cutting oil and hot steel. The air tasted faintly of brass filings. Pete taught me to read a worn bearing by sound and to tell a compressor on its last legs by pitch. He showed me how to probe a bearing with fingertips and how to follow a vibration pattern until the root cause revealed itself. I learned that a rejected lot number always traced back to a rushed setup, that overtime always followed a supervisor who skipped the pre-shift, and that quality slips clustered on Friday nights. Bored with theory, I built a simple spreadsheet to track downtime, an Excel dashboard with color-coded cells, nothing fancy, but it worked. Dad called it cute and handed me a to-do list for the Founders' Day picnic. When a supplier shorted us on threaded rods, I renegotiated terms and kept the line running. On Monday, Todd took the credit in the meeting and Dad congratulated him. I learned it was safer to hand my wins away than to ask for my name on them. Doing the work kept the plant running, not being seen kept me safe. Dad's playbook was proximity for Todd and pressure for me. He put Todd in front of customers even when Todd mangled alloy grades or mispronounced technical terms, because visibility mattered more than accuracy in his calculus. I got the cleanup jobs, the midnight calls to fix a bottleneck, the weekend shifts to untangle a shipment mismatch, so the morning reports read smooth and the flashy meetings could stay shiny. When I suggested staging raw materials closer to the lines to reduce setup time, Dad called it secretarial. When Todd repeated the same idea at a vendor dinner, Dad called it visionary. Once I tripped on a coil strap left loose on the floor and Dad said with a laugh that hid sharpness, "You're too clumsy for leadership." He never mentioned the strap had been left loose. Boundaries were treated as liabilities. Asking for clarity earned the label difficult, and executing silently earned dependable. The message was relentless and simple: men propose, women fix. Mom taught me the soft skills Dad considered indispensable. She smoothed edges, phrased dissent as gratitude, and left rooms prettier than she found them. When I passed my operations certification, she framed a clipping about Todd's charity golf tournament instead and said, "People notice headlines." Inside our family, merit functioned oddly. Compliance bought you protection, not recognition. Every slight, every misplaced credit, every small public erasure went into a private ledger in my head. I didn't keep it as grievance so much as data. What do they reward? What do they ignore? Who repeats mistakes without consequence? I got good at not needing applause. I learned to want leverage instead. I started writing timelines after big mistakes, mapping cause and effect the way no one else did. That mapping became a habit, incidents, responses, omissions neatly logged. The wounds were quiet, but they taught me strategy. HR asked me to lead a women in manufacturing panel at a regional conference. They said it would be good for the company's image. Dad skipped it for what he called a strategic golf scramble. At the conference, I spoke to a room of plant managers and early career engineers about fixing systems, not sitting politely in the back. A vendor pulled me aside afterward and offered a follow-up meeting. A week later, Dad took credit for a supplier introduction that began because I'd sat in that vendor's booth for 40 minutes. Once, a vendor dinner ended with a handshake deal I'd negotiated about just-in-time delivery. We cut waste, improved flow, and the vendor's rep called me the next week to say how much smoother their warehouse ran now. Dad stood up during a quarterly call and toasted Todd for representing us so well at that dinner. I was offered a raise in gratitude with no title change. When I asked what a title might look like, the raise evaporated in a week. I trained 2 supervisors who later were promoted as advisors to the executive team, an odd phrase that put them above the shop floor but below accountability. I learned the final lesson: be essential, remain optional. My competence became the hidden scaffolding of other people's images. The Founders' Day luncheon invitation listed Todd as keynote and me under event logistics. The font choice felt like a tiny insult. My name in a smaller weight tucked into a corner. Mom smoothed the invitation with her hand and said, "Be gracious, it's important for family to present unity." She meant well. I laid out place cards in the banquet hall that week, folding each one with a steady hand, aligning them so the table looked symmetrical from any camera angle. I ironed a dress that wouldn't rustle when I moved tables, set a hairpin neatly in my bag, and put a packet of Advil in my purse because I knew the fluorescent lights made my temple throb. I packed a thumb drive with a safety update and rehearsed the 3 sentences I might say if someone threw me the microphone. The AV tech, who knew me by sight from coordinating plant meetings, told me I wasn't on the program. I slipped the USB into my pocket anyway because it felt like insurance. I decided I would not seize the microphone, I would not make a scene, I would not let them edit me into the script of an emotional daughter so they could applaud themselves for magnanimity. Still, there was a small hollow feeling that evening, like the mouth of a wound I didn't yet understand. I didn't know I would leave that night with a suitcase and only my passport and laptop to my name. The week of the luncheon tightened like a fist. HR sent an email asking if I could pick centerpieces and coordinate with catering. Todd called me from his office and said, "Can you send me your notes on the quarterly numbers? Dad might bring them up if he gets a question." His voice had the casual entitlement of someone asking for a favor from a sibling, not a request that would erase someone else's work. I designed a 1-page margin analysis because I wanted to be helpful. When the program printed, my slot had been moved to supporting materials. A supplier called to confirm an incorrect order Todd had placed. I corrected it, stayed on the line to reroute the shipment, and got a thank you from their junior rep. Mom practiced a toast about family continuity at dinner and slid my line, "Please enjoy dessert," into the script like a tiny closing remark. I brought the USB with the safety update to the venue and handed it to the AV tech under the pretense of backups. He smiled and said, "You're a lifesaver." The smile was for the logistics role I'd been given. The tech told me the program was closed. Someone higher up had decided attendees needed a smooth, short celebration, not extra talking points about maintenance. I felt the coil tighten. Exclusion was tidy. Every small shove toward the margins was deliberate. It was choreography, not oversight. Backroom positions were dressed up as merit. Board packets circulated in the week before the luncheon with a photo of Todd in a suit and the watermark incoming CEO across the top months before any formal vote had occurred. Ellen, the board chair, when I asked why my operations report hadn't been included in the executive summary, said, "Optics matter, Ashley." It was a phrase that sounded like strategy but translated to keep certain images at the front and inconvenient realities at the back. HR ran a confidence in leadership survey that only listed two names in its multiple choice options, Dad and Todd. When I questioned the bias, HR smiled and said surveys were designed to measure public sentiment. Two operations managers pulled me aside in the hallway and said quietly, "We'll follow you." But at the luncheon, when lights brightened for the applause, they put their hands together for Todd. Conversations in the corridors began to feel curated. Someone would approach with half a compliment, then check for cameras as if the line between private and public had been rehearsed. A mid-level manager told me, sotto voce, that the board had already agreed on a press release. A senior HR director referred to strategic narratives and avoided looking me in the eye. Every exchange felt like an audition. I could be warm and invisible, or I could be loud and dangerous. The choreography made dissent seem petty and unanimity feel inevitable. I understood then that merit could be neatly boxed and displayed or quietly boxed away, depending on what the people at the top wanted the room to believe. He winked at the HR director and asked whether she'd printed enough press releases for the fans. She smiled the way people smile when they've been told which story to help tell. He requested lighting changes for his photo op. AV moved a spotlight so it haloed him during Dad's remarks. He joked to a supplier about how we'd keep the girls on the home front and received a chuckle from someone who'd always chosen comfort over reflection. At one point, he leaned across the table and said softly, "Don't worry, sis, there's always HR for girls like you." Like HR was a safety net and not the apparatus that would hand out press releases to humiliate me later. Everything he did was designed to underline a hierarchy. Casual slights dressed as casual conversation, jokes that landed like stakes. His entitlement was not loud in the way an argument is loud. It was loud in the way a piano left playing in a room fills the house with its notes. It announced itself by how other people shifted to accommodate. I felt it as a pressure in my chest, an old sediment of inevitability settling in. But beneath the pressure, something else tightened, less emotion than calculation. I cataloged each phrase, each smirk, each stage direction he gave the staff. They would become data later, tone, timing, witnesses. For now, I watched him perform and kept my face smooth, letting the room see only what the room wanted to see. The room itself was built to tell a story. The banquet hall smelled faintly of butter and trumpet squash from the chafing dishes, with a hum from the old HVAC that made a distant band of sound behind every sentence. We set up a portable stage, a podium that cleaved the room into people who give and people who receive. My place card sat at the far table near the exit as if logistics were an honor. The head table had a gilded nameplate for Todd and a reserved spot at the center of the room. Projector slides cycled through legacy photos, sepia-toned shots of Dad with welding goggles, staged images of Todd shaking hands with suppliers. AV checked mics with brisk nods, a snap of feedback, a breath, another click of a remote. Pete walked the floor like a teacher on a field trip, shepherding new hires to their assigned seats, his palms still smelling of machine oil. I had my contingencies. Water pitchers lined the tables because the lights made throats dry. I had a small kit in the canvas bag under my chair, spare mic batteries, a pack of aspirin, a paper clip to clear jammed name tags. The USB with my safety update lived in the pocket of my dress, a warm coin I could have used if someone had handed me a microphone. AV ran checks while I ran rehearsals in my head. Stay measured, speak in numbers if given a chance, don't let the scene become about how I felt. I watched the camera angles as they were checked, 2 staff cameras meant to document, a business journal reporter set against the back wall with a small tripod. The room's layout was choreography, who stood where, who clapped first, where the photographers would direct their lenses. I recognized the script. I had written variations of it in my head for years. The final straws were small, soft humiliations meant to fold me down into place. A floor supervisor, Pete, leaned toward me before the luncheon and said, cheeks pink with sympathetic embarrassment, "Ashley, you're a lifesaver. Can you move these extra chairs?" The words were kind, but the tone suggested pity. Mom squeezed my hand at the table and said, "Smile, no one likes a sore loser," as if my face were a performance and not a response to being shouted down in a room full of people. A supplier caught my eye and murmured, "Shame they don't see you," and then stepped away when a camera swung that direction. A human resources director arranged a neat stack of glossy press releases at the back of the room, the kind of thing you hand out to make an event feel inevitable. Todd mouthed, "Watch this," like a magician revealing a trick, as if he were about to conjure my diminishment for applause. The choreography was methodical. They wanted me helpful, invisible, and standing by. Each small demand, move the chairs, fetch the water, check the AV, was part of a long accretion of expectation that left no room for protest. I complied because it had always been safer to comply in public. But as I stacked the chairs that afternoon, each folded metal leg felt like a tally mark on a page where I had quietly been counting offenses. The final straws were not dramatic, they were precise. They tightened the noose of public perception until it fit. When the microphone finally clicked under Dad's hand, I realized the room had been set not just for a celebration but for a spectacle designed to remind me where I belonged. Dad tapped the microphone twice and smiled the smile he used when he wanted judgment to taste like a party. He said, 50 years of family leadership, and the room clapped on cue, the kind of applause that comes from scripts, not feeling. He named Todd the next chief executive officer and called him a born leader, and the room, well-drilled, echoed the approval. Then he added the line that would cut me open in public, "Ashley's too clumsy to run a business. Men are better leaders." He delivered it with the half-laugh people use to soften a slap, the laugh that makes the sting land softer on a listener but sharper behind a person's ribs. My name became a punchline in a sentence that taught the room a lesson about lineage and gender. The press releases appeared like stage props. HR had them folded and glossy, complete with Todd's photo and Dad's quoted praise. Cameras clicked. A business reporter framed the shot to catch the two of them together, hands on the podium as if the family seal had been stamped. I kept my face still. My breath was slow and deliberate. I let the room see what it had chosen without giving it the story it wanted to tell about my tears. People glanced at me the way people glance at a painting in a hall, recognition without responsibility. Someone laughed at the clumsy line, someone shushed them as if civility could cover cruelty. I recorded the cadence of the room, the particular way applause followed a certain syllable, the intake of breath when Dad's joke landed, the camera angle shift that favored the men. Those sounds and angles would become pieces of evidence later, but in that moment they were just the shape of the dismissal I finally felt in my bones. Employees looked at me, then looked away, then looked back again. Faces I'd nodded to 100 times sat frozen in that flicker between recognition and the safety of joining the script. A supplier sidled up and offered the automatic "Congratulations, congratulations, Todd," and then added to me in a tone almost apologetic, "Your sister is such a team player." It landed like a small stone. A laugh bubbled somewhere in the back at Dad's joke about me being clumsy. Someone shushed the laugh as if manners could patch a wound. I felt the rhythm of a pointed performance, applause where applause belonged, the camera turning to the men at the front, the narrative tightening like a corset. I registered everything, the angle of Sandra's phone, the way the release reflected light into Todd's lap, the shift in the room when someone read the headline out loud. Those images would be used to tell a story later, but in that moment they were the instruments of my erasure. I kept my voice even, my face still, and let the documentation of their choice accrue on glossy paper and in pixels. Pete asked me if I'd mind moving the spare chairs for late arrivals, his cheeks flushed like he was apologizing for life. I stood and nodded, set down my napkin and folded the chairs with practiced motions. They were warm from being stacked in a corner, metal humming faintly under my fingers. I carried them past the stage and felt Todd's eyes on me as if he were cataloging the scene the way a director checks a shot. As I passed, he smirked and mouthed, "Thanks, sis," like a coronation blessing offered to someone who had been reduced to a prop. The smirk hooked across his face with the casual cruelty of someone used to being handed the center. It was the kind of gesture that wasn't loud but contained entire histories. The missed credits, the dinners that celebrated his touchdowns and ignored my reports, the times he'd taken what I'd fixed and framed it as his capability. The lights found the stage and cast the rest of us in a softer glow. Shadows settled over the workers at the peripheral tables. I stacked the last chair, felt the dent of the foot against the carpet, and set it down with the same calm I used to steady teams at 3 in the morning when machines stopped speaking intolerances. My hands didn't tremble. My mind, though, moved with an old logic I'd long since learned. If you carry things for people long enough, you either become a doormat or you learn where the fulcrum is. The smirk was a fulcrum. I kept my face composed as I moved back to my seat and let the room fold its preferred narrative around me. The chair didn't weigh more than anyone else's, but the meaning it carried in that moment did. I felt something reconfigure inside me, less a collapse than a quiet decision tightening into shape. After the applause and the staged photos, I went back to my office and opened the drawer I'd been keeping tidy for years. I forwarded myself the files I'd built, process maps, vendor terms, maintenance logs, one by one, as if sending them out of the building would be enough to remove any temptation for appropriation. I cleared the few personal items I kept. A small spider plant with a new leaf, a chipped mug that read "Best Boss of the Worst Shifts," a notebook with neat entries and a single sentence underlined. Control is the point. I packed a suitcase with suits and heavy boots, the kind that don't mind standing in a shop floor puddle, and folded in a passport and my laptop. I walked past Dad's office. He lifted his hand in that casual wave that is both perfunctory and presumptuous. He offered the invitation to stop. I did not stop. At home, I left a note for Mom. "I won't argue with a verdict." The words felt strange and small and true, the kind of sentence that contains distance and boundary. I slept with the suitcase by the bed and woke before dawn with the plan percolating in a clarity that was almost clinical. I did not shout or post or call the press. I walked out with my name in my mouth like a seed I would plant somewhere else. The city was gray as I drove away, light pooling in gutters, and I listened to the engine hum as if it were my pulse. Leaving was not dramatic. It was an efficiency measure. I made a promise to myself that night in the back of a cheap motel booth as I signed a new bank account and scribbled ideas in the notebook I'd taken. I promised I would not litigate respect at the dinner table or chase apologies that would ring hollow. My terms were simple and deliberate: no public rants, no half measures, no moves I couldn't enforce. My goal wasn't catharsis. It was control. If Dad thought his applause was the last word, I decided my response would be to buy the ledger that dictated the last word. I wrote down constraints: stay within the law, don't burn bridges I'd need later, no ethics compromises. I would build competence in the world they'd ignored until I could sit at the table with the papers that mattered and change the outcome by contract and by capital, not by drama. I set out rules for myself like a project manager would set milestones. I would keep my head steady and my voice measured. I would learn every letter of debt covenants, every clause that could trip a covenant, every accounting footnote that hid risk. I would surround myself with people who valued numbers, not pedigrees, partners who understood how to buy assets quietly and how to hold governance accountable. I underlined one sentence at the top of a fresh page. Control is the point. Under it, I wrote smaller: no theatrics, no shortcuts. I slept with that notebook under my pillow and woke to a new day that smelled like concrete and possibility. I studied the parts of business Dad never taught me: debt covenants, what banks actually watch, the language of lender agreements, and what triggers a default. I sat with mentors who had rebuilt factories and with lawyers who said things plainly. Covenants are rules that can pull the plug. I listened to fund managers explain how they watch cash and days sales outstanding the way others watch weather. I learned to read a balance sheet not as a set of numbers to admire, but as a set of levers to pull. I took jobs that let me fix ugly profit and loss statements without theatrics, and where success meant the phone stopped ringing with complaints. I cultivated partners who respected competence, not pedigree, and I kept my head down enough to build reputation and loud enough to have references. That combination, numbers and trust, became the quiet currency I could spend later. Nora and I formed Harborline Capital with a simple thesis: buy troubled industrials where fixing operations created real cash and not just headlines. We pitched patient investors who liked steady cash flows. We hired a compliance lawyer to make sure the structure we used to acquire debt and equity would pass a careful look without drama. We opened 2 acquisition vehicles, Baygate Holdings and Flintrock Partners, so the market wouldn't see Harborline's hand too early. The vehicles were clean, with bank accounts and reporting systems and a covenant monitoring dashboard that pulsed alerts when key metrics moved. We built relationships with regional lenders, people who underwrote local industrial portfolios, and we learned which institutions sold distressed notes and which held them like porcelain. Harborline knew how to buy without shouting intent. We kept our names off the early filings on purpose. Stealth is often the friend of strategy. I put Harwood Tool and Forge on our watch list the way a surgeon marks a case. With a private tag and a timeline, public reports started to show the cracks: a minor recall here, a late payment notice there. I combed through OSHA feeds and industry newsletters for anything that looked like pattern and not just a single event. Annual report footnotes told me more than the glossy pages. The line of credit had a springing covenant tied to safety and earnings, and there was language about accelerated default if EBITDA fell below a level. I followed UCC filings and noticed a regional bank had filed a blanket lien that included inventory and receivables. On a forum, I read a former employee's post about unpaid overtime and a near-miss nobody had reported internally. These were all small things alone, but together they formed a perimeter around a vulnerable company. I mapped the timeline: when safety incidents happened, when cash flows slipped, who approved overtime, who refused CapEx. I marked inflection points where the board's oversight, if it failed, would trip bank covenants. I waited not because I wanted them to fail, but because patience lets leverage arrive without begging. Acquiring debt quietly was an exercise in patience and procedural discipline. I had met Grace in an earlier deal. She moved with the kind of calm bankers adopt when they measure institutional risk. When she mentioned a legacy borrower under review, I asked for the portfolio code and did not blink when she replied with numbers. Baygate made an offer for a sliver of the term note, enough to gain reporting access and start asking questions under confidentiality. We signed non-disclosure agreements, provided proof of funds, and closed quickly on the minority position. The bank tested our seriousness: calls from counsel, a request to demonstrate that we could close on short notice. We obliged. As performance slid and rumors tightened, Flintrock Partners stepped in and bought additional tranches from a participant bank that wanted off the exposure. We structured the purchases so lien positions aligned in our favor. If covenants tripped, our lien assignment put us first in line on certain assets. None of our names screamed Harborline on the agreement. They read Baygate Holdings and Flintrock Partners, neutral and forgettable. We built reporting relationships with the bank and gained access to internal information that legally buyers of notes are entitled to receive. The work was boring and delicate. Transfers of notes, assignment paperwork, a few carefully framed calls. I did not call Todd or Dad. I did not make threats. I built position by position until the ledger tipped and our leverage was real. We gathered affidavits from former employees who were willing to sign a statement about ignored lockout and tagout procedures and the time they were forced to work without proper guards. A few were scared. One woman hesitated before she signed and said, "I don't want my name in a paper that brings trouble." I told her I understood and asked only for the truth. The council redacted names for initial reviews and created a chain of custody for every document. We captured maintenance logs that contradicted production reports, time cards showing unpaid overtime, and vendor emails that confirmed late payments. The safety consultant's report had photos, a chronology, and a plain conclusion. These weren't random mistakes, they were repeated failures after notice. Our counsel wrote a memo titled Failures Causing Breach Summary of Cause. It didn't use dramatic words, it used clauses and dates and consequences. It laid out the path from negligence to breach in language that could not be whispered away as family politics. That file became the spine of our case. I asked Tom for a private coffee in a diner near the plant. He sat across from me with a chipped mug and a folder that looked like it had been carried in a truck cab, soft corners, grease on the edges. He listened with the steady, patient attention of someone used to hearing complaints from workers who'd been run into the ground. I put the debt documents on the table and explained the leverage in plain terms. If covenants tripped, we could force a restructuring that protected workers and kept the company running. He slid his hand over the paperwork and said, "We've been asking for safety for years." He showed me the overtime logs and the list of grievances that never made it to the board. He told me about people sleeping in their cars between shifts because there was no overtime pay to take care of travel. We drafted an employee ownership tranche tied to margins and safety metrics, not to headlines. We promised priority for restitution, back overtime paid out of non-core asset sales, a safety capital expenditure program in the first 90 days, and protections so any future sale would respect the tranche. Tom wanted guarantees the plan would be real and not a PR bandage. I agreed to an independent trustee to hold the ESOP tranche and a clear, irrevocable schedule for the restitution payments. He asked for communication discipline, no leaks, no grandstanding. We shook hands on confidentiality and set a small, strict team: Tom, 2 shop stewards, a union lawyer, and our counsel. He nodded once, the way people do when a plan is built for impact and not applause. The alliance wasn't charity, it was leverage with a human face. Michael called from his downtown office with a list of concerns laid out like a procurement checklist. I went to meet him in a conference room that smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. He had been the procurement head at our largest client for years, and he'd started calling my team with quality complaints we'd been too proud to hear. I proposed a contingent purchase order, a multi-year supply agreement that would activate only if certain triggers were met, new executive slate confirmed in writing, an independent safety audit passed, specified capital expenditures completed, and initial quality metrics achieved. Michael wanted objective triggers he could measure. We defined defect rates, first-pass yield, and on-time delivery percentages. Legal drafted the contingent purchase order with an escrowed letter of intent so activation would be immediate upon meeting the criteria. We negotiated the escrow details in precise language. The customer would place funds into a letter of intent escrow once governance change was documented, and the funds would be released upon third-party certification of the safety and quality metrics. Michael's relief was small and practical. He wanted stability in the supply chain without rewarding current negligence. He signed an LOI with a thin smile and a firm pen stroke that made the contract feel real. That document would be the day-one proof of revenue under new leadership. It was as simple and as powerful as a cash register ringing at the right time. We scheduled the bailout meeting at a private equity firm's glass-walled conference room downtown because the transparency mattered. Invitations were formal: Dad, Todd, Ellen, 2 board members, Grace and her counsel, Tom, key suppliers, and Sandra with a courtesy background-only note. We prepared 2 neat stacks on the table: a swap agreement and a removal for cause resolution. Counsel prepared signature lines and redlined indemnities until the language was tight enough to bind. We preloaded the presentation with covenant charts, a chronology of safety incidents, and the negligence file. Nora rehearsed the deck until she could flip the slides with her eyes closed. I had the silent clip from Founders Day cued to play without sound so the room would see the pattern, not hear the melodrama. We drafted the bank's notice of covenant breaches but held it unopened. Our leverage would be a choice, not a surprise attack. We had a black cover sheet to hide Michael's contingent purchase order labeled Day 1 Revenue and name placards set so optics would not distract from governance. We lined up Grace to read the default language and prepared for the board's duty of care questions. Ellen's priorities, reputational risk and duty, were mapped with an option for her to remain on the board in a reconstituted role if she cooperated. The meeting was choreography built for inevitability, everything visible, everything documentable, no private alternative narrative. We set our constraints so the board would have a clear, enforceable path. Accept the swap and the new governance or face the bank's acceleration and an immediate foreclosure process. I rehearsed saying I'm the owner until it landed as fact, not emotion. The room was ready to hold the truth. She asked the hard questions about indemnities, about exposure for past decisions. I had already run the scenarios with counsel, so my answers were short and practical. We would provide directors and officers coverage tail where appropriate. We'd offer her the audit committee chair under a new governance framework. We would include language that limited liability for past acts unless there was willful misconduct, which our file did not support for her. Those were lifelines, not bribes. The thing Ellen cared about most was not cash, it was being seen as prudent rather than reckless. I left room for her to choose a path that let her sleep at night. When she signed off, it was not because she liked me, but because the alternative felt like stepping into a storm without a coat. She chose the coat. After Ellen, the board's resistance softened because the choice had been framed as governance, not vengeance. They were not saints, they were people who wanted to leave their names on documents that future readers would call prudent. I gave them that. The negotiation was surgical and for me, a lesson in how respect is often about the options you leave other people, not the orders you give them. I did not need allies who were ashamed. I needed stewards who could hold the company while we fixed what had been broken. Ellen's nod at the end of our meeting felt like a hinge clicking into place. I treated the media frame like another piece of choreography. I invited Sandra and told her she could come as an observer, not a participant, with strict terms about recording until the papers were on the table. She agreed because the story was a rare one, a family company on the brink and a possible rescue. I arranged for 2 cameras to be in the room, one from the private equity firm we were using and a second from a hired team I trusted to document the proceedings in a way that looked neutral. I wanted the visual record to match the legal record, clear, indisputable, and not subject to rumor. Nora wrote the few sentences I would say and I memorized them until they sounded like facts and not anger. I rehearsed how I would say I'm the owner until it landed like a statement of position rather than a dare. I set my phone to do not disturb the night before and left it face down in my bag. I told no one outside the small circle what was happening, no mom, no old friends. Control is easiest when you preserve silence. Leaks give other people time to fabricate counter-narratives. The cameras and the journalist would be witnesses. The silence around the meeting would be the force that kept our plan from unraveling into gossip. I wanted the moment to be seen exactly as it was. A legal and financial turning point, not a family drama. Keeping myself cold was a cost I accepted early on. I blocked Dad and Todd on my phone months before because I knew the worst bait is the one that arrives late at night, full of entreaties and insults that are hard to resist answering. I started running at 5 in the morning so I could tire out the part of me that wanted to rush and react. The cold air and the steady breath did something small and practical. It gave me hours in which my limbs were occupied and my mind could not invent fights. I kept a therapist on retainer to make sure my strategy was not a mask for a vendetta. She asked blunt questions and kept me honest about motivations. When my answers drifted toward cruelty, she pointed it out. Discipline is not a virtue if it blinds you. I learned to let small provocations slide, an email with a passive-aggressive line, an old photo resurfaced with a flattering caption for Todd, a supplier calling me Ashley the support. I trained myself to wait 24 hours before replying to anything that felt personal. That delay let me see if a reaction was necessary or simply a reflex. The coldness had practical costs. I missed a few family events intentionally, and I sacrificed small comforts like the warmth of immediate vindication. But the payoff was leverage that could not be undone by a late-night text or a public apology offered for optics. Staying cold meant I could use patience as a tool. Staging the room was about removing private alternatives. We reserved a long, glass-walled conference room where the city hummed beyond the windows and no one could claim a secret meeting had taken place. Name placards were set with intention. Dad and Todd on one side, their names bold and centered, Grace, Ellen, and Tom opposite, with suppliers along the wall and Sandra at the back with a small tripod. I chose the head seat not for theater but because sight lines matter. When you own the seat, you own the flow of attention. Nora handled the deck. She had practiced the slide transitions until they were second nature. Counsel sat where signatures could be passed efficiently. We put water and pens at each station and two neat stacks on the table, one labeled swap agreement and the other removal for cause, CEO chairman. Under a black cover sheet labeled Day 1 Revenue, we hid Michael's contingent purchase order so that when it was revealed it would read as proof of immediate viability rather than hope. We placed the bank's default notice in a red folder, visible but unopened, so the room could see the consequence of inaction. The pens were identical, the paper crisp, the signature lines were pre-numbered. We set an arrangement of chairs for key witnesses, Tom and two shop stewards, a couple of suppliers, and Grace with her counsel, so there would be no question about who was present. Lighting was neutral. No one looked like a villain caught in bad light. Everything was documentable and plain. The room needed to hold a truth that could stand up in print and on camera, and it did. We had EBITDA trends on one slide. 3 down quarters, margins compressing, working capital tied up in receivables that weren't turning. Another slide showed payment lags to suppliers and a chart mapping overtime spikes to production shorthands when maintenance was overridden. I watched Todd try to point to a supplier invoice and claim blame, and we turned the next slide to the email where he had explicitly approved a ship date over a written maintenance request. It was in his voice, time-stamped with the sign-off you can't take back. Dad called it temporary turbulence, but the charts were stubborn, a 3-year drift, not a blip. The room's energy shifted when the math took the stage. People who'd been quiet found their mouths forming the same question. What happens if the bank enforces? Grace answered that, 2 foreclosure, asset sales, vendors putting holds, and possible calls on personal guarantees. The numbers didn't gossip, they presented an ultimatum. I didn't speak. I let the paper and slides do the case-making for me until it mattered that I did. I slid the negligence memo across and watched Ellen read the first page with a face that tightened. The memo was lean, documented failure to follow safety protocols after repeated notice, dates, and references to the company's own procedures. Our counsel cited the bylaws, the clauses that allow removal for cause when negligence creates material risk. To make the point visual, Nora cued the clip from Founders Day, silent, 15 seconds of Dad delivering the line that turned my name into a spectacle. It played on the screen not for sympathy but to show pattern. Dismissal of safety concerns, dismissive culture, and a public example of what the record already chronicled. The counsel's language was plain and procedural. He read the sections that mattered. Duty of care, board exposure, and the real legal risk if directors ignored documented negligence. Ellen's eyes flicked to the indemnity language we'd pre-offered, then back to the memo. I watched her calculation happen in real time: reputation versus litigation, continuity versus liability. She asked one quiet question about D&O coverage tails, and our counsel answered clearly. That little exchange told me everything. Governance could be managed or it could burn. The negligence file was not a moral sermon, it was a ledger, and ledgers are harder to pretend away. I laid the swap agreement on the table and felt the paper's weight. The offer was simple in structure and brutal in effect. A debt-for-equity exchange that installed Harborline as the majority owner, immediate removal of Dad and Todd for cause with parachutes voided under documented negligence, and terms setting up restitution funds paid from non-core asset sales. An ESOP tranche was carved out with clear vesting tied to margin and safety thresholds. Day one capital expenditures for safety were funded from the initial asset dispositions. I explained the mechanics, not the revenge. This was how we would stabilize operations and protect workers, and it required governance change now. Refuse, and the alternative wasn't vague. Grace confirmed the bank would enforce acceleration, file foreclosure by the end of the day, and issue vendor credit alerts that would be hard to unwind. Personal guarantees would be called on if company assets were seized. I lifted the black cover sheet and revealed Michael's contingent purchase order, an escrowed, signed commitment to multi-year supply that activated upon the governance change and third-party safety certification. It wasn't a promise, it was revenue that would hit the books under new leadership. The choice was clear on the table: accept stability on our terms or face the bank's terms and an ugly, fast unwind. Todd's face went a color I recognized, hot and thin. He slapped the table with a hand he hadn't known he needed and said, "You can't do this." He reached for a pen like he could claim a page he hadn't written. Dad tried the old cadence of condescension. "Ashley, be reasonable," as if I were negotiating allowance for a curfew. I slid the signature page toward him and watched his fingers tremble. He looked to Ellen. Ellen's jaw tightened and she said, "Our duty is clear." For a moment the room held its breath like a theater going quiet before a reveal. Todd pressed his thumb to the pen and signed. Dad's hand hovered, then set ink to paper. They signed not because they wanted to, but because sitting on the other side of the table would have meant letting the bank pull the lever. It was governance, not grace, that made them put their names where consequences lived. When the last signature met the line, Dad asked, almost pleading, "Do you work here?" as if clinging to old roles might buy him a different reality. "No," I said, steady and loud enough for the cameras. "I'm the owner." The cameras caught the documents in my hand, the black cover removed, Michael's PO visible, and the face of a man who had thought his script infinite. I announced appointments without drama. Claire would be Chief Operating Officer, Jenna Chief Financial Officer, both effective immediately. Tom stood and confirmed union support, the shop stewards nodded, and Grace read the bank's forbearance letter under the new governance terms. There was no theatrical gloating. I let the signatures, the PO, the ESOP terms, and the safety commitments speak. The room shifted around the new chain of command like a river finding a new bed. Pete, who'd asked me to move chairs months earlier, met my eye and tipped his head in a small, private recognition. I nodded back and felt the work begin. The unraveling had cost them face, money, and control. It had given us a legal and financial path to fix what they'd neglected. Control, I'd promised myself, not catharsis. In that moment, with ink drying and cameras still whirring, control looked like quiet reconstruction, steady, competent, and final. Dad asked, in a voice that was both incredulous and pleading, "Do you work here?" as if clinging to old categories could change the ink on the page. "No," I said, and the cameras caught it clear, factual. "I'm the owner." People leaned forward like a tide shifting. The line of command rewired itself in a few minutes. Claire rose and, without fanfare, walked through the first steps she'd already planned. Immediate safety audits, a temporary hold on unvetted shipments, and a recall plan integrated with supplier contracts. Jenna turned the first sheet of a cash plan and spoke in numbers that made decisions feel inevitable instead of optional. The cameras had recorded the signatures, the PO, and the exchange of stewardship. The new chain of command was both legal and practical. It didn't look like revenge, it looked like governance finally doing its job. Removal letters were drafted that evening and filed the next morning with the legal precision of a seal. They were for cause, the language clean and uncompromising, and the attached clauses rendered parachutes void under documented negligence. Personal guarantees were flagged and notices prepared. The bank's counselors made calls that did not sound like condolences. Vendors received updated credit advisories. New terms, tighter limits, and a timetable for remediation, no more casual patience for late shipments. We set up a restitution pool funded by the sale of non-core assets. The ledger showed where money would be directed: back overtime, safety capex, and the ESOP tranche. Sandra's article ran within 48 hours with a headline that turned the arc of the luncheon into a public turning point. From punchline to owner, a turnaround begins. Dad's calls to the bank went unanswered. Todd's LinkedIn post was a thin, defensive thing that had comments turned off within hours. At the country club and in the supplier lounges, people whispered not about my audacity but about the negligence they had not wanted to see. There's a certain permanence to an executed document. It sits in a file and reframes every prior conversation. They could complain in private, they could toast each other in cliques, but the removal for cause, the voided parachutes, and the bank's moving phrase, acceleration, were not things you could unring. Those consequences reached beyond bruised egos. They touched bank relationships, insurance renewals, and personal credit lines. It felt oddly small and absolutely decisive at once. The cost of their choices was now a set of transactions and public notices that would require attention and repair, not excuses. Day one under the new leadership was a study in practical mercy. We started with lockout/tagout retraining that morning and left no wiggle room for ambiguity. The shop floor smelled of cleaning solvent and oil as guards were replaced and bolted. Machines with missing guards stayed red-tagged. Operators had shadow shifts with Claire and senior techs to rebuild confidence in processes rather than heroics. Claire reworked the production schedule so we stopped celebrating last-minute saves and instead built predictability. Staggered changeovers, mandated overlap for shift handoffs, and a clear protocol for maintenance shutdowns. Jenna cleared the chart of accounts like a window wiped clean: reconciliations, accurate cost centers, and a weekly cash forecasting schedule that moved us from monthly guesswork to a disciplined cadence. Purchase orders were tied to defined delivery metrics, and pose above threshold required second sign-off. We held a plant-wide town hall where we put numbers on a screen and left out pep talk theatrics. I explained the ESOP tranche with plain math, percentages, vesting schedules, payout models, because people deserved to see how ownership could actually translate into pay. We posted Michael's contingent PO on the bulletin board as a promise in black and white, a client willing to transact if we fixed safety and governance. Non-core assets were identified and slated for sale to fund immediate capex, new guards, additional safety staff, and a restitution pool for unpaid overtime. For the first time in years, competence was rewarded with resources rather than being used as a theatrical prop. The rebuilding was not about myth-making, it was about hard choices and capital allocated to do the work. Social life at the company recalibrated in ways that felt both awkward and relieving. People who'd fussed over camera angles now chose their words with a care that bordered on suspicion. Those who'd once waved off my contributions began addressing me by my name and title in emails and in meetings. Pete found me on the factory floor a week later, palms still smelling of grease, and said, "I'm sorry about the chairs." He looked embarrassed in a way that carried both apology and grief. I said, "We all carried something," and meant it. Ellen sent a handwritten note admitting she should have asked more questions over the years. Her penmanship wavered in a way that made the message feel real. Some managers came with formal requests for second chances. I granted a few, but each acceptance came with conditions: clear metrics, oversight, and probationary timelines. Suppliers stopped leading emails with "Dear Sir" and began addressing me directly. A vendor rep who used to call Todd first now routed technical issues to Claire's inbox. I did not correct anyone's memory about past slights. I built a new record with actions, minutes, and signed memos. People adjusted in different ways, some with quiet humility, some with thinly veiled resentment, but the change in tone was unmistakable. Mom called twice in the first week. I let both calls go to voicemail and listened later, carefully, before responding with a message that described the safety upgrades and the ESOP plan rather than offering explanations. Family noise rose and fell at the edges, but the company's internal social geography had shifted. Respect became a requirement and competence its currency. Todd alternated between thin, angry texts and probationary apologies that read like small contracts. If you do X, I'll do Y. I blocked his number. Blocking was a small, efficient thing that kept him from baiting me into late-night fights that would derail everything. Dad left a voicemail where he said, "I thought you'd call," and then, softer, "I didn't mean." I deleted it without listening to the last half. Silence became a deliberate tool. It had teeth. I didn't invite Mom to board meetings or involve her in governance. I sent her the monthly safety snapshots the way you send a relative back a photograph. No caption, just evidence that something real had been repaired. There were family messages leaked through intermediaries, an aunt asking if I'd put the family through this, and a cousin posting a vague congratulations on social media. I replied to none of it. I declined a family mediation that came wrapped as concern but centered their discomfort. The mediation would have been a theater where contrition could be staged and then shelved while nothing changed on the floor. I didn't want theater. I wanted a ledger. My silence was not emptiness. It was a boundary that required other people to act if they wanted contact. I answered with actions, restored guards on machines, paid out restitution checks, and a clear ESOP statement posted where the night shift could read it on a bulletin board under fluorescent light. Months later, I stood at the same glass wall where I'd watched my reflection during the luncheon. The line ran clean now, parts arrived on time, yields were up, and the hum of the conveyors had a steady pitch that said efficiency rather than scramble. I walked the floor with Claire and Jenna, not to be seen but to see. Claire checking torque on a new guard, Jenna reviewing a reconciled ledger on a tablet, an operator pointing out a friction point they felt confident enough to name. The plant smelled of oil and new paint and the faint sweetness of heated metal. I posted one internal memo that I left plain and unadorned. Standards are love in a factory, safety first, truth next, margin follows. It wasn't a slogan. It was practice. I visited the banquet hall months after the fight for a vendor awards dinner that had nothing to do with family history. They handed me the microphone to introduce the keynote speaker. I didn't flinch. I didn't perform. I said a few sentences about supply chain reliability and thanked teams who kept machines honest. I kept the notebook that began with "Control is the point" on my shelf and added a final line across the bottom of the last page. And now, so is stewardship. I didn't forgive anyone because forgiveness had never been asked for. I governed because leadership was always the work. Control was not a prize to be taken in a moment of triumph. It was a responsibility I had chosen to own. If my story hit a nerve, tell me where you're listening from and share your own in the comments. Subscribe and switch on notifications, there's more coming. And if you've been sidelined, hold your line, control the ending.